I'd like to welcome Congresswoman Judy Chu to the podium, and we are very lucky to have her as our representative, somebody who isn't afraid to speak out and to move for action. Congresswoman Chu was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in July 2009. She represents the 27th Congressional District, which includes Pasadena and the West San Gabriel Valley of Southern California. Representative Chu currently serves on the House Judiciary Committee, where she is a member of the Subcommittee on Intellectual Property and the Internet, as well as Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security. She has been an avid supporter of immigration reform and of ending the immigration detention bed quota. She has toured the Adelanto Detention Center, visited people in immigration detention, and spoken with people after they have been released from detention. Let's give Congresswoman Chu a very warm welcome.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Orlando, Luis, and Jessica, for saying those very moving words. I was very, very touched by those words and by your experiences, and you are so brave and courageous for sharing your experiences of being in an immigration detention facility and your experiences with being undocumented and with deportation. It's important for us to hear what you are going through. Well, let me tell you, it was back on May 5th this year that a group of advocates visited me. They told me about the countless abuses at the Adelanto detention facility, including inadequate health care, arbitrary and overuse of solitary confinement, and lack of sufficient food. Immigrants who choose to remain in detention and fight their immigration cases face extreme risk to their safety and lives. And so they told me about cases like that of Mr. Fernando Dominguez, who died in detention at Adelanto. Fernando, an undocumented father of 5, chose to remain in detention in order to convince immigration officials to let him stay in the U.S. Fernando had lived in the U.S. for 20 years before being detained. While waiting for his immigration hearing in detention, Fernando contracted pneumonia, and because of a lack of proper medical care at Adelanto, he was transferred to a hospital where he died days later. Only after his death did the U.S. Office of Detention Oversight investigate the medical staff at Adelanto, finding that Fernando's death could have been prevented and that the Adelanto staff did not comply with government guidelines. The advocates brought to me a former detainee, Carlos Hidalgo. Carlos told me about the terrible conditions there, that the water was putrid, the food had mold on it, the library was out of date and did not have the legal documents necessary to petition. He said through his tears that he was one of the lucky ones, that he could speak English because he'd been in the country for 24 years. So he had more knowledge about the legal system. Most of the detainees did not. So I decided to visit and see for myself what the conditions were like at Adelanto. In July, I was taken on a very controlled visit by ICE agents and GEO administrators. In fact, he called himself the deputy warden. While the ICE agents were cordial, the GEO administrator was outright hostile. Clearly, he resented anyone questioning their contract. And so I saw immigrants that were locked up like criminals, many who had minor offenses such as driving without a license or who were subject to mandatory detention because of reentry violations. Well, I was prepared by the advocates to expect many ways of deterring me from seeing things. They told me that they would try to take me only to the West End and not to the East End where there were worse conditions. And so I asked to go to the East End. I hurriedly saw the GEO warden suddenly making a lot of phone calls when I said that. I spent 3 hours doing things that I did not think that they expected me to do, looking at everything in great detail, looking at the expiration date on the milk orange juice and all the eggs. I picked up every phone I saw to see that they were actually working. I opened up every computer and looked at the files on it to make sure it was working and that it actually had the current legal documents. Although I did not see any visible problems, I'm sure that they fixed it up right before my visit because it was planned weeks in advance. And in fact, after the three hours passed, there was not enough time to actually see the east end of the facility. However, I do feel that my visit shook them up because they know that there are members of Congress who are watching them and who are demanding accountability. When I came home, I was appalled to see the news that Adelanto was expanding. The proposed plans mean it will become one of the largest immigration detention facilities in the country with 1,940 beds. I believe that before there is any expansion, there must be assurances that the facility is adhering to the ICE's detention performance-based standards. And since these standards are not codified in law, that there must be proper oversight. Without this, an expansion of the Adelanto facility is inappropriate and irresponsible. The problems of Adelanto are a reflection of a larger problem regarding our immigration policy in this country, particularly the mandatory detention of those who are guilty of nothing other than violating immigration laws. Since 11 million have no way of coming out of the shadows due to our broken immigration system, mandatory detention has become a system that's grown massively. It is so massive that ICE is incapable of overseeing it. So ICE has resorted to outsourcing these operations to private companies like GEO that build detention centers in rural, isolated communities that are desperate for any type of income. And then there is the outrageous congressionally mandated quota, which actually requires the detention of 34,000 people daily. Can you imagine jails, if every jail in this country actually demanded that it have a certain number of inmates in it daily? But what this mandate does is to provide a windfall to private companies that build prisons. The GEO Group receives more taxpayer dollars for immigration detention than any other government contractor. And with the Adelanto expansion alone, it stands to gain an additional $21 million each year for its shareholders. In Congress, my colleagues and I are working to eliminate the bed mandate. I, along with 80 members, sent a letter to the House Appropriations Committee urging the committee to rid ourselves of the detention mandate and instead promote alternatives to detention which are far less costly and yet equally effective. It's outrageous that currently taxpayers spend nearly $2 billion a year or $5.4 million every single day on immigration detention, when there are alternatives to detention like release on bond and community-based programs that are not only more humane, but less expensive at between 70 cents and $17 a day. Not only that, these programs are successful and have a 91% appearance rate at immigration hearings. Now, I'm also fighting to stop the expansion of family detention. Because of the spike in Central American migrants apprehended at our southwest border, DHS has expanded family detention. DHS has begun to use family detention as a deterrent strategy with over 1,000 women and children in ICE custody, many of whom are asylum seekers with very, very young children. There are now 3 family detention centers running in this country, with a 4th soon to open in Dilley, Texas. But in my opinion, it is clear that there is no way to detain families humanely. The use of family detention is problematic because it is re-traumatizing survivors of violence, because the families do not receive adequate access to counseling, and because families are more likely to be deported back to further persecution with no or little due process. In fact, the decision to deport these families may be predetermined before the facts of each case are truly heard. Reports have shown that the mothers and children are subjected to a more demanding, credible fear standard that would have provided them with relief, as shown by the fact that if these cases ever do get to an immigration judge, over half of the negative credible fear determinations, that is the denials by asylum officers, actually get overturned, at least at the Artesia detention facility. In addition, ICE is also pursuing a no bond or high bond strategy, making it almost impossible for these families to get a bond to be released from detention while they fight their immigration cases. All these facts show that something is not right at the Artesia Family Detention Center, and we have to do something about it. And that's why last week, I and several of my colleagues sent a letter to the President urging that the expansion of family detention be stopped immediately and that these very serious problems be resolved. Most importantly, of course, we must fix our broken immigration system, and in particular, our broken enforcement system, so that those who have meritorious cases for prosecutorial discretion aren't swept into deportation and detention. Now, we had high hopes for immigration reform. I was one of the 5 leading co-sponsors of H.R. 15, our comprehensive immigration bill in the House. We worked hard for 2 years to get this passed. We actually had the votes to get it passed. We had 200 votes on the Democratic side and 30 on the Republican side, and you need 218 to pass a bill. But Speaker Boehner refused to put the bill on the floor because of the Tea Party folks. So it could have been done. Instead, he pulled the plug, and now we are faced with administrative relief, and we have to make sure that administrative relief is done in a way so that it does provide relief. And so we will be seeing some kind of final order in this lame duck session of November or December. And as a member of the House Judiciary Committee, which has jurisdiction over immigration legislation, I've personally met with the Secretary of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, and other White House officials to press for true relief. I urge them to narrow their enforcement priorities and to stop prioritizing individuals with only immigration law violations, and to make meaningful improvements to its use of prosecutorial discretion so that we can promote family ties to the community. And when I return to Washington, D.C., I will continue to put pressure on them to make sure that our immigration system can become more humane. So let me say that I'm grateful to all of you in this room to showing concern about this very big issue that makes so many people suffer. I certainly will continue to advocate for the end of the bed quota and for greater oversight and accountability, especially for these private companies that are running these facilities. Let's all work together to convince the nation to act. Thank you all very much. Now, I was so very touched by these 3 individuals who shared their stories with us today that I just had to bring certificates of congressional recognition to you for sharing your stories and for working so hard to make sure that we get something done on this very, very critical issue for our nation. So if you could come forward and please accept this from me, Orlando Arzate, Luis Bravo, Jessica Bravo. I give this to you in recognition of your unwavering commitment to advocating for immigrant rights and for your courage and fortitude, which we hope will have a lasting and positive impact on this nation.